that, you know, I made the point there is a lack of contemporaneous witnesses, and JP has agreed that, and he has said but. So I think you will acknowledge that far. It is exactly as I said. Now, okay, we have moved to Tacitus. So let's make it clear. We have moved to our first, and I presume our prime witness, to the early in the 2nd century. So this is where Christians turn for their first witness in the stand. Tacitus, writing probably around about the 110, 112, something like that. Now, as a preamble, let me first of all establish something about the behaviour of Christians during the period in which they transmitted to us Tacitus and every other source we have to rely upon. Because we're in the unfortunate position now that our evidences have to be brought forward from the very people whose interest it is to withhold information or to alter information. We don't have copies of Tacitus that have come to us without being passed through the Christian filter. Now, have we any reason to doubt the honesty of these Christians? Well, let me address that one very directly and say, yes, we can demonstrate in infinite detail how, from the very beginning until the present day, Christians have lied and fabricated evidence. Now, where should we begin on that? We can begin with the very Apostle St. Paul, who actually warns the brethren in Thessalonica not to be deceived by a letter falsely written in his name. Now, whether that letter to Thessalonians is itself a forgery or not, either way, we have evidence here of fraud. That is at the beginning. Subsequently, we have correspondence fabricated between Seneca and the Apostle Paul. We have a fabricated letter, apparently written by Jesus himself to the king of Edessa, and so on and so on. You know, Christianity is fraudulent in tooth and claw, and it goes all the way forward through the donation of Constantine, where the Pope claimed a right to the Western Empire, all the way through to the bone box of James that was touted around a couple of years ago. So we have a source for Tacitus that is tainted by a long and an unworthy record of forgery.
Okay, so the contention is then, JP, that your reliance on Tacitus's history is marred by the fact that it would have passed through Christians' hands who would have added to it, deleted from it. What do you make of that?
All right. Well, he says he's predicted a yes but as I said, if it's a valid but, there's no reason to say that you've got anything on me there. Let's put it this way. As I said, we can use any argument like this to also disprove any other historical figure. I've done the same thing to disprove that Rabbi Gamaliel existed. All the testimony we have of him, except in the book of Acts, which we can discount automatically, of course, comes from the hand of Jews who wrote the Talmud. Well, they obviously had a very strong confessional interest in having a wonderful teacher like Gamaliel exist. It says, in fact, in the Torah, or in the Talmud, when Gamaliel died, the honor of Torah ceased, and purity and piety became extinct. Well, obviously, Gamaliel must have been a rallying point used to keep Jewish persons in line after the troubling period after Bar Kokhba. I find many things suspicious about that. Gamaliel was such a wonderful Jewish leader, supposedly, but he's not mentioned by Josephus. Surely he would have recognized him as some kind of wonderful person if he actually existed. Now, you get my point here. I actually don't think that Gamaliel never existed. I agree that he did. But we can use these same kinds of reasoning to dispute and get rid of any historical figure. Charges of bias are very easy to make. Charges of confessional interest are very easy to make. And it's also very easy to arrive at guilt by association and say, well, because of one forgery, that means all these other things have been forged too. That's not how historians work. Now, he mentioned several different forgeries or claims of forgery. I have articles on each, but let me just briefly mention a couple of things that I would say in response to those. In terms of Thessalonians, I don't think there was a forged letter. I think Paul is saying that because the Thessalonians misunderstood his first letter, and he is thinking that perhaps someone wrote one in his name, and that is why they're confused about it. He is just making a guess. There was no actual forgery. In terms of the bone box of James, well, that's been looked at even more deeply. I understand that many of the authorities who declared originally a forgery have been debunked, but that's another issue, and we don't want to get into that too much detail, I would think. Things like the correspondence between Seneca and Paul. Well, I'm not too clear that these things were intended to be understood as forgeries as opposed to something like edifying fiction. I mean, we don't know exactly what the intent or purpose was with some of these documents. This would be like someone picking up a book by Marjorie Holmes, who is a writer of devotional fiction over here, and saying, well, this book, Two from Galilee, was a forgery intended to show history. I don't know that we can be sure that something like the correspondence between Paul and Seneca wasn't simply something theoretical that was put together to say, well, here's what would happen if this happened. Something like a Harry Turtledove novel. I don't know if you have Harry Turtledove over there.
We don't, but I know the kind of literature you're talking about, the kind of thing where you might, yes, create a correspondence between two historical characters, but it's for a fictional purpose.
Yeah, sure. Now, let's not be we can't be absolutely certain that many of these documents were intended to be taken as authentic, as opposed to being simply thought experiments. Now, this is a very broad thing, but you can't simply just say guilt by association, therefore the works of Tacitus were interfered with. You have to have some evidence that the works of Tacitus were interfered with. Now, all we have really, and I've noticed this on Ken's website, is he says that there was a particular point where the word Christians, as spelled C-H-R-E, was changed to C-H-R-I by scribes. Well, that's not a difficult issue. The scholars are aware of it, and we know what the answer to that is. It was simply a matter of scribes perhaps doing a little textual criticism of their own, thinking that perhaps someone along the line had miscopied and misspelled the word Christians, and fixing it with the I rather than the E. This is a normal textual critical answer. There's no need to go further into conspiracy. And it is noteworthy as well that when Tacitus mentions Christus just previously, he spells it with the I, and there is no dispute about that word.
Okay, I mean, we're majoring on Tacitus, and perhaps we'll keep going on that. I'd like to come to the Gospels as well, because I think, if you like, they are the primary source for most people who don't delve into the history too much, so it would be worth doing that as well. But essentially, I mean, JP is saying, where's your evidence on the Tacitus front that this wasn't meddled with by over-eager Christians? Ken?
Yeah. Can I respond to the comment of use of conspiracy? I'm not suggesting there's a conspiracy. I'm suggesting there's certainly a tendency throughout the whole history of Christianity to embellish the doctrines and the sacred texts. There's a tendency to put in what they would like to see, and we can see that shown in the manuscript evidence of marginal notes then being written into the body of the text. We can see how the text has been improved to meet with what people thought should be there. Now, I gave several examples of forgery, but we could go on and give several others. One that I will mention, I won't bother with too many others, but the first canon list, so-called after Muratori, lists actually has the comment, there is in circulation an epistle to the Laodiceans and another to the Alexandrians forged under the name of Paul. Now, that is not quibbling about misunderstanding. That is a clear statement from an orthodox text making clear that there were forgeries at that stage. So we're not into a conspiracy here. What we are into is the creation of a myth which has been perpetuated through generations. Now, if we want to look at Tacitus in more detail, let's do so, because I'm happy to do that, because I think here is an example of a very famous paragraph in Tacitus, which Christians use an awful lot, but in actual fact has great question marks hanging over it.
Okay, give us this passage and why you doubt it then.
Well, as JP will know, he's referring to something that appears in the Annals of Tacitus. I think it's in book 15, where he basically talks about Nero fastening the guilt of the fire that had affected Rome on the Christians. Now, it's a very lurid and well-written couple of paragraphs about and everyone is familiar with this very memorable scene of the torched Christians decorating Tacitus' garden, so-called. But I find that questionable simply because if we look back to the other history of Tacitus, written earlier, that is the histories, in Book 5, where he actually discusses the Jews particularly, he makes no mention of the Christians. He makes no mention of this notorious torching of Christians by Nero in his garden. So we can go through it phrase by phrase if we felt it was necessary, but I think, it's salutary to note that this primary witness for the historical Jesus is a passage in a book to which we are indebted to Christians who are known to